Welcome to session 2 of today's workshop. Session 2 is on Beyond RCEP and CPTPP towards further regional economic integration. My name is Eunice Huang, and I am an adjunct fellow with the RSIS. And my day job is running Google's trade policy work in the Asia Pacific region. So this is a topic that's very close to my heart. Today, we are very privileged to have three very, very established and renowned panelists with us to discuss this very important topic. I think there's been a lot of interest in regional trade agreements, especially with the movement towards the end of last year with CPTPP and the renewed interest in that, and also the coming into force of RCEP on the 1st of January this year. So today, I just want to dive right in and introduce the panelists that we have. The way we're structuring this is we're going to have 3 presentations, and then we're going to have a session of Q&A where you're free to pose any questions that you may have in the chat box. If you have specific questions for specific panelists, please do indicate so that we can direct the questions accordingly. But if it's just a general question, that's fine too, and we'll hear from the different panelists. So without further ado, let's dive in. The first speaker that we have today is PT Sri Sangnam. He is director of the ASEAN Studies Center at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand, and this is a position that he has held since 2013. He holds a PhD degree in economics from the University of Melbourne and a MA degree in International Economics and Finance from Chulalongkorn University. He has also been teaching international economics and microeconomics for bachelor and master degree students at Chulalongkorn University since 2002. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to PT. I think he has some slides and he'll be presenting his thoughts on this topic. PT, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning and sawadee krap. Let me start by thank you GRIPS and ISIS Singapore that organized these very good sessions, and thank you for inviting me to take part in these prestige sessions with the renowned scholars. So today's topic is about the Beyond RCEP and the CPTPP towards the further regional economic integrations. Let me start by presenting my outline. Today I will present to you 3 topics, but these 3 topics will be concluded into one word, which is RCEP, equivalent to opportunities. I think the RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships, is the opportunities for 15 countries in Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Oceania to strengthen the regional value chain to support the recovery of the global value chains. Then the second topic is about this RCEP will create an opportunities for ASEAN and our dialogue partners to be part of this recovery GVC. And last but not least, I think RCEP is the good opportunities, is the good starting point for preparing ASEAN countries for a further complicated trade negotiations, especially CPTPP in the near futures. So I think I will start with this diagram. You see, I think nowadays, take part in global value chain is the thing that most of the countries would like very much to participate, because according to the studies by World Bank, take part in global value chain will create economic growth, will create a better employment opportunities, and last but not least, reduce poverty. And this is the flows of global value chains from before COVID-19 and prepare to the post-COVID-19. Global value chain will recover to the same value at the 18 trillion US dollars again by 2023, according to the estimations by Boston consultant groups, and they collected the data from trade finance model, UNCTAD, UN Comtrade, OECD, World Economic Forum, and so many organizations. The green lines represent the trade flows that is increased significantly throughout the periods, while the red line present the contractions volume of trades during this period, okay? And the black line is unsignificantly changed in terms of like the value of international trade among the parties. And as you can see, the global value chain will did already recover since 2021, I mean the last quarters of the 2021, and will go up throughout this year, 2022 and 2023, to reach the same amount. But the face, the look of the global value chain is totally, completely changed. And of course, this confirmed the thing we call decoupling, right? Because the recovery of this global value chain will separate the global value chain into two big regional value chains. The regional value chain in the Western countries led by US and European Union, and the Asian regional value chains. As you can see, we have a very, very big line, big red line that link US and China, as well as EU and China. So that means trade war is still there. For the next 2 years, no American firms, no European firm would like to invest in China. And at the same time, Chinese investors also don't want to invest in China because produced in China cannot export easily to EU and US. They need the third party. The third party to use this production base to get access to a bigger market, China, EU, and US. And it seems like all business people and economists agree that ASEAN seems to be the locomotive of this recovery of the global value chains. Hence, the RCEP will help us because this is the only, I can say, higher standards and more comprehensive FTA that the whole regional value chains of Asia integrate into the global value chains, right? Because RCEP cover not more than just the traditional FTA, but we also talk about the issues of like e-commerce, trade in services, intellectual property rights, and so many new standards. RCEP, I think you guys already know that was concluded by the 2019. Unfortunately, India still cannot participate after a very, very long round of negotiations. Nowadays, RCEP can be considered as the largest free trade agreement in the world, comprised of about 1/3 of the global GDP and 1/3 of the world populations with 15 member states, ASEAN 10, plus Japan, Korea, China, Australia, and New Zealand. And this is the 20 chapters of the RCEP. And this is among the very, very first agreement trade deals that most of the ASEAN countries join in new aspects, such as government procurement, promotions of small and medium-sized enterprises, talk about competitions, talk about e-commerce, talk about the protections of intellectual properties, as well as more open in terms of trade in services, as well as the movement of natural persons. So these highlight the yellow color is a new issues that is more comprehensive and higher standard for most of the Southeast Asian nations that we participate in RCEP. RCEP is, of course, will provide us a tariff eliminations for about 92% of good trades among RCEP countries. There will be more transparency in terms of the implementations of the non-tariff measures. The rule of origins will benefit countries like Thailand a lot because we cannot produce things from raw material to final product, but we use so many parts from our regional value chains, including the EEE sectors, electronic equipment and electrical appliance, automobiles and parts, chemical and plastics. Thailand can combine these rule of origins and export with a special privilege under RCEP to our most important trade partners, as well as the custom procedures and trade facilitations. You know, Thailand and most of Southeast Asian nations, we export a lot of agricultural products and food products. And under the custom procedure and trade facilitations, Article 4 of the RCEP, the custom clearance process for this group of products will be within just a very, very short period of 6 hours. And for most of the traded goods, it will be past all the custom clearance within the 48 hours. This is very, very good. As well as the trade in services, at least more than 2/3 of the RCEP service sectors will be fully open in the next period of times. For the investments, we also talk a lot more about investment state dispute settlements, because nowadays countries like Thailand have a larger number of the value of foreign direct investment outflow. We invest a lot in Southeast Asia. And we also hope very much that the e-commerce, for most of the Southeast Asian nations, among top 10 of the total volume of trades, cross-border e-commerce seems to be a very, very huge share in this top 10 value of trades. Hence, we would like very much to see a more online personal information protections, transparencies, paperless trading, and of course, the other type of trade facilitations over the cyberspace. For intellectual property rights, competitions, and government procurement, this is a very, very new area that most of the ASEAN countries never participate before. Hence, this will rise up, this will raise our bar, this will create a higher standard for ASEAN in order to take part in these global value chains. And it was assigned last 2 years, and now it was fully implemented. Compared to other FTA 2.0, as you can see from this diagram, RCEP seems to be more user-friendly because it will not touch much up on the issues that is more complicated, such as TRIPS+, especially on patent linkages, patent term exclusion, patent term extensions, data exclusivities. These three issues is not included in RCEP. That's why negotiating RCEP and implementing in RCEP is more easier and more convenient. And it's a very, very good starting point for ASEAN. It's more like a, baby swimming pool for us to learn how to swim before we go to an open ocean, such as the agreements of the CPTPP, which talk more about patent linkages, while the FTA with EU talk more about patent term extensions, data exclusivities. This is also included in the FTA, European Free Trade Association as well. There will be another new standards that we have to, prepare ourselves for comply, especially for the countries that have a very, very big agricultural sectors, such as the International Union for Protections of the New Variety of Plants, or UPOV 1991. In RCEP, we don't mention much. We don't mention at all about the implementations of the UPOV 1991. But other trade deals, I mean, the FTA 2.0, more comprehensive, higher standards, all of these trade deals focus a lot on this UPOV 1991, including the CPTPP, USMCA, trade deal with EU, FTA, and EAEU. So this is a thing that if we would like to go beyond the RCEP, we may need to think more. In terms of government procurement as well, RCEP is more like a starting point to introduce us to a more complicated versions of the government procurement agreements. But after we learn about this, I think it's a good opportunity for us to adapt ourselves, especially to have a more transparency government procurement to join CPTPP, USMCA, EU, FTA, and EAEU, as well as the standards of the labor, the compliance with international labor organizations, such as the establishments of the associations and rights. And of course, another big issue that is also concerned a lot in Southeast Asia, especially the countries that have a very, very strong government, as well as China, is the issues on the state-owned enterprise. The new kind of trade deals, not RCEP, but most of the new kind of trade deals focus more on how to let state-owned enterprise act in accordance with commercial considerations. So as I told you earlier, RCEP is the opportunity for us to join the recovery global value chain. And at the same time, this is the forum that prepare us to a more comprehensive and higher standard FTA in the future. So for the status of Thailand right now, and I think most of the ASEAN countries, since we see a decoupling, Western Bloc and Asian Bloc regional value chain that combine into global value chains. All countries, especially in Southeast Asia, would like very much to be a, connecting point to connect these two regional value chains together. and the tools, the main tools, in order to allow us, Thailand, to be that connecting point. We put a very, very high hope on negotiating an FTA. Now, Thailand have 38 FTA at hand. 14 is under consultations and studies. 9 already negotiates. The newest one is ASEAN Canada. And we have 14 signed and ineffective FTA. This allows Thailand to do trade without tariff, without non-tariff measure with 18 custom territories. But of course, compared to the best practice in Southeast Asia, Thailand is not at the front line because we cannot compare to Singapore and we cannot also compare to Vietnam. Vietnam, it's more like a rising star, and we in Thailand compare a lot with Vietnam because now Vietnam have about the same number of design FTA that already implemented and ineffective, 13 FTA. But Vietnam can do trade with 53 custom territories around the world without tariff, without non-tariff measures. Hence, Vietnam can position itself as the interconnected link to link the global value chains. And this is the thing that we may need to learn more from our neighboring countries. And we also would like very much that it will be better if we cannot position only Thailand to be that part, but how about ASEAN as a whole? How about ASEAN Production Network as the middleman between Asian regional value chains and Western global regional value chains? So in order to have a trade deal with countries like in other part of the world, especially in North America and South America, we may have to consider more about negotiations and joining the CPTPP. Unfortunately, some of the issues, I mean the bold fonts in these 30 chapters of the CPTPP agreement in this slide is a little bit challenge for us because it is, like I told you earlier, higher standards, more comprehensive, more complicated. So we have to learn, maybe slowly, but we learn a lot from RCEP, and we would like very much to continue the same mechanism in order to, join CPTPP and other trade deals. There's a questions as well from the organizer to me about India. I think now India still has a significant outstanding issues that still remain unsolved to join RCEP. But of course, for the past 15 years, RCEP, India take part and very, very active in negotiations process. But until now, this is the unresolved issues in India. First, RCEP talk since early 2000 decades. But the government right now, BJP government just, become the government in 2014. Hence, they still don't agree on the issues of base here because they think, oh, I'm the new guys, just, have an executive level and admin India in 2014. How come we have to accept the thing that was deal before us? They also don't agree on the so-called auto trigger safeguards. They would like very much to issue auto trigger safeguard without noticing to other countries. They don't agree with Russian obligations. They need to reserve the right in order to keep in tariff rates and all non-tariff measures back again. They also don't trust countries like China in the issues of data localizations. And of course, the biggest issues, it's most of the business people as well as individual people in India still see trade deficit as a negative force. They don't want any minus sign in their trade balance, especially in these four main sectors: milk and dairy products, automotive industry, textile and apparel, as well as iron, steel, and products. And of course, India is also never trust this mechanism because they also see the interventions of the superpower in other aspects apart from international trade and investment. Hence, in conclusion, I think for me, RCEP is still the opportunity because this is the opportunity to strengthen the regional value chain to support the recovery, but decoupling of the global value chains. RCEP is the opportunity for ASEAN and dialogue partners, including India. Of course, we have a special rights for India. If India ready and would like to join us, no more negotiations, they can just implement it. So India will be a group, and we would like very much to bring India into this process. And last but not least, RCEP is a good starting point for preparing member countries for such a more complicated trade negotiations, include CPTPP, and of course we talk more about FTAP under the APEC forum. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, PT. That was very, very interesting. I really liked your analogy of the baby swimming pool. I think it's a really accurate depiction of RCEP, about learning how to swim before going into the ocean, the big open ocean. I think there are probably a lot of questions that people have from your presentation, and we can take them on during the Q&A session. So let me just move on to the next speaker. Next speaker is Professor Shujiro Urata, who is Professor Emeritus of Waseda University. He was Professor of International Economics of the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies in Waseda University. He is also currently a Faculty Fellow at the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry, RIETI, specially appointed Fellow at the Japanese Center for Economic Research, Senior Research Advisor of the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia area, Visiting Fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute, and Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Institute of Developing Economies. Professor Urata received his bachelor's in economics from Keio University, an MA and PhD in economics from Stanford University. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor over to Professor Urata, please. Professor, I think you might be on mute.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I was going to say I'd like to thank the chair lady to introduce me, and then I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk about the issues of my interest and issues of my very importance. What I listened to Dr. PT's presentation with a lot of interest, and I was kind of concerned that what I'm going to say is very much what he said, but I tried to maybe introduce some new information in addition to maybe repeating of what Dr. PT said earlier. So what I like to do is to talk about the first kind of historical developments leading up to two mega FTAs, RCEP and CPTPP. And then I now turn to the achievements of what the RCEP and CPTPP has done. And then I talk about the challenges. And then after that, I'll talk about the way toward FTAP. Let's see. Oh, how do I? Oh, here. Okay. So I see the origin of RCEP goes back to maybe around 1990s, when many countries in the world were trying to form kind of regional economic cooperation, like say EU in North America, NAFTA was being discussed, and East Asia, Prime Minister Mahathir suggested the East Asia Economic Caucus. I think this is in response to movements toward regional economic integration in other parts of the world. And then ASEAN established after ASEAN Free Trade Area in 1992, and then not so much movement until the 1997-98 when Asian financial crisis hit the region. And in order to avoid a repetition of the Asian financial crisis, many countries in the region were eager to set up a kind of regional economic cooperation mechanism. One of the specific idea that they had was to form East Asia Free Trade Agreements, consisting of ASEAN +3, ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea. And this was in early 2000s. ASEAN +3 or East Asia FTA was promoted very actively by China. And then Japan proposed ASEAN +6 framework, which is called CPR. And feasibility studies went on until 2010, 2011, I think. And then China and Japan got together and to kind of submit the joint proposal to ASEAN +3 meetings. That was the we should go ahead and say form East Asia regional framework, regardless of either ASEAN +3 or ASEAN +6. And then ASEAN came back with the idea of RCEP in 2011, I'm sorry. And then actual negotiation started in 2012 and then go on. And then during the process, as was pointed out by Dr. Pitti, India dropped out, but so remaining 15 countries enacted this RCEP, and that went into force this year. And looking at the other side of, well, the earlier development that I just described was what is happening in East Asia. When we look at the developments in Asia Pacific, it was, I think the beginning was 1989 when APEC was formed. And in 1994, Bogo Declaration was delivered, which is to establish free trade and investment environment in Asia Pacific. And this was a very interesting framework which calls for voluntary action. And voluntary action didn't really happen the way APEC members expected. So 4 countries got together and to form a free trade agreement, which was in 2006. Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore formed P4, which later turned into TPP. And then in 2006, the United States proposed the idea of FTAP, Free Trade Area of Asia Pacific, which includes all 21 APEC economies, member economies. And then in 2010, this is expanded TPP negotiation. The TPP negotiation started, I think it was 2008, with 4 countries, but in 2010, they decided to increase the issue, like financial services. And then United States was very interested in being included in this negotiation. And so US showed interest, and then other countries showed interest as well. In 2010, 8 countries got together and then started negotiation. And then later, 4 other countries, Malaysia, Canada, Mexico, and Japan joined the negotiation. And then the negotiations are concluded in 2016, and the countries went into a ratification process, but the United States decided, well, this is President Trump decided to withdraw US from the TPP, and then remaining 11 countries got together and then set up the CPTPP, which went into force in 2018. So this is the very brief history of what happened in two kind of strands of the way to achieve, to try to establish, on the one hand, RCEP, on the other hand, CPTPP. So one of the points I wanted to make is that it was a long history, almost 30 years, that went into the formation of these two mega FTAs. And for RCEP, particularly ASEAN played a very important role. And ASEAN is called ASEAN Centrality. They had a very important position. They contributed a lot to the formation of the RCEP. Now, let me turn to achievements. Here, again, I'm afraid that what I'm going to talk about are very much what's been said already by Dr. Pitti. Here, before that, sorry, this is a map showing RCEP, CPTPP, and later I'd like to discuss that these two can be a very important pathways to FTAP. And looking at the size of these two mega FTAs in terms of population, GDP, trade, percentage of world, RCEP is huge compared to like CPTPP, like 30% population, GDP, and trade, whereas for CPTPP, it's significantly smaller. And later, I'd like to discuss that the FTAP, which covers APEC economies, if that is established, it accounts for more than 60% of GDP, 50% of trade, and so on. So it's a very big, really mega FTA. Now, coming back to the achievements, here, this is same information, I think, which we heard already. What I did is the comparison of the provisions, issues, which are covered by RCEP, CPTPP, and WTO. So RCEP has a so-called WTO extra or WTO plus provisions. As you can see, e-commerce, competition policy, which are covered in RCEP but not in WTO. But comparison of CPTPP and RCEP tells us there are provisions which are covered by CPTPP but not by RCEP. State-owned enterprises, labor, environment, competitiveness and business facilitation, and so on. So comparison of CPTPP and RCEP indicate that in terms of comprehensiveness, the CPTPP is greater than RCEP. In terms of liberalization and trade and investment, here again, CPTPP is greater than RCEP. Level of commitment, CPTPP is greater than RCEP. But when it comes to economic cooperation, this is a very important part of RCEP. Because of the developing members, CLM to be precise, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, these are the countries which receive special differential and special and differential treatment from the other members. So again, to help these countries to implement the commitments, economic cooperation plays a very important role in RCEP, whereas CPTPP, there's not such a provision. Now, and here, this shows the level of trade liberalization or commitment and tariff elimination commitment. If you compare here, I have so-called ASEAN plus 1 FTAs. This is ASEAN plus Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN plus China, ASEAN plus India, ASEAN plus Japan, ASEAN plus Korea. And then average of these ASEAN plus 1 FTAs. The numbers show the percentage of the tariff lines where zero tariff or no tariff will be applied at the end of the grace period. and this is RCEP, and this is the average of ASEAN plus 1. If you compare these two columns, you can see RCEP for some countries is lower than the ASEAN plus 1, which are already implemented. See, so that really tells us RCEP has a lower level of tariff elimination. And of course, CPTPP, practically about 100% for all the members. So again, in terms of trade liberalization, RCEP has a lot of room for improvement. And that is part of the challenges that I have here. But first challenge is the implementation of the commitments. Of course, that has to be monitored, enforced, and that's not easy, and that has to be done. And the second challenge here I point out is to increase membership. CPTPP, we already have application from the UK, China, Taiwan, Taipei. And I understand that Thailand is interested in joining CPTPP. Korea showed interest, and so on. So it is very important to increase membership because the benefits of FTA comes from, well, has a lot to do with the number of members. The larger the membership, the larger the benefit that you can expect. So for CPTPP and also RCEP, we talked about India. Yes, India, it'll be in the interest of India, as far as I'm concerned, and for other members as well. Possible other countries include like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, these South Asian countries. And then next challenge is the, yes, for RCEP, as we saw, there are several provisions which CPTPP had, but not RCEP. So RCEP needs to increase this coverage and also need to upgrade quality. I already talked about the level of trade liberalization. But there are many other areas where RCEP can improve. Now, finally, the road to FTOP. In 2010, APEC Leaders Summit in Yokohama, Japan, leaders agreed that there are three so-called pathways to establish FTAP, which is considered to be the goal or objective of regional economic integration in APEC area. So three pathways are ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6, and TPP. ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6 later turned into RCEP, and then TPP turned into CPTPP. And as we heard from Dr. Pitti, the level, and as I said, the level of commitment and the coverage of commitment is more limited for RCEP. So it's good to start with RCEP. Those countries' economies which can join CPTPP can join CPTPP, but if they're not ready, they should try to improve their capability by using technical and economic assistance in the RCEP program, and then become CPTPP, and then CPTPP with increased membership, and which eventually covered 21 APEC economies, and possibly, you know, non-economies like UK, maybe Colombia. So again, this is a way, a possible way that the way toward the establishment of FTAP. Let me end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Urata, for the very detailed explanation of the two pathways. It's quite amazing that 30 years went into the formation of these two major agreements, and hopefully it will not take another 30 years before we get to the FTAP. We will save the questions for later during the Q&A. I have some questions myself, but without further delay, let me introduce the third speaker for today, and that's Jeffrey Wilson. Jeffrey Wilson is the research director at the Perth US Asia Center. He provides leadership and strategic direction in developing the center's research program across its publications, policy, and dialogue activities. Dr. Wilson specializes in the regional economic integration of the Indo-Pacific, and he has particular expertise in the politics of trade agreements, regional economic institutions, and Australia's economic ties with Asia. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Dr. Wilson. Please take it away. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Eunice, and thanks everyone for coming to join us for this really esteemed group today. Well, I don't have any slides. I would just like to talk to this group and hopefully we can transition into discussion at the end of the presentations. But, you know, following on those two very comprehensive presentations, I'd like to broaden things out a little bit to put the region in its global context. And I'd start by making the observation that regional economic integration in the Indo-Pacific is in surprisingly good health right now. As we've just discussed, we've got these two new and globally significant mega-regional trade agreements. You know, RCEP, the world's largest regional trade bloc, which entered into force on the 1st of January, and the CPTPP, which after quiet operation for a couple of years, seems like it's about to enter an expansion phase with 5 potential new members lining up. So we've been never closer to getting to FTOP than we've been over the last 30 years, as Urata-san has explained. But I think that development's all the more surprising when we view it in the context of the global trade system challenges that we talked about in our panel earlier on today. We've seen a massive turn towards protectionism, a still unresolved US-China trade war, serious issues in the WTO's negotiation and disputes functions, and also the emergence of geopolitically driven coercive trade practices. So the Indo-Pacific is doing exceptionally well when we have a look out the window. But I think it would be a mistake to think that the region's trade future is safe or secure, because many of those threats facing the global trade system augur very poorly for a trade-exposed region like ours, and neither the CPTPP and or RCEP is properly going to offer protection. And so I'd like to argue that it's time that this region needs to take its demonstrated commitment to trade through these blocks global, so to speak, by advocating for the principles embedded in these mega-regional trade agreements into more global level trade and economic fora. The first point I'd like to make, and this is just to address a constant bugbear that annoys me for my constant writing and commentary and advice on regional trade agreements, you know, addresses this question of is RCEP and the CPTPP, are they competing trade blocks? And the answer is decisively no. There is this common view out there that the two are competing models for the regional trade architecture, you know, which is kind of, you can understand why people have this view because they've got different objectives, different memberships, different provisions. You know, we might even say RCEP and CPTPP have different philosophies about where the trade system needs to go next. And it's also been contributed, this belief, by geopolitical conflict. You know, particularly discourses that RCEP is a China-led agreement or the TPP was a US attempt to contain China. And, you know, and some of these ideas boil down into the view that we've got these two mega-regional trade agreements and one of them has to be the model, but not both. The reality is they're actually extraordinarily complementary due to their different purposes. And I'd probably just draw attention to what I would argue are the 3 objectives of a major regional trade agreement, which would be liberalisation or reducing tariff barriers, harmonisation or getting everybody on a single regulatory framework, and the issue of new rulemaking, how we can go into what used to be called Singapore issues that we're now calling WTO+. RCEP's largely a harmonisation agreement, stitching up the ASEAN 5 of the 6 ASEAN +1 FTAs into a single rate agreement. And that alone creates huge gains from trade. The benefits to companies in global value chains of having a single rules of origin regime alone are probably worth doing RCEP just for the ROOs chapter. Now, RCEP, as Urata-san's pointed out, is pretty weakly liberalising, but that's okay, because a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of tariff cutting was done in those prior bilaterals that have been folded into it. And then the CPTPP gives the regional rulemaking agreement, breaking new ground in a whole heap of WTO plus areas: investment, environment, e-commerce, IP services, financial services, telecoms, and many more. So we've got a fairly obvious and beneficial division of labour in the regional trade system here. Bilaterals over the last 20 years have done the heavy liberalisation work. RCEP then harmonises these into a cohesive bloc, and the CPTPP allows the more ambitious reform-ready members of the region to move forward with new rulemaking. That seems like a very nice set of trade architectures that all fit together. But I also think this good news, it needs to be tempered a little bit, because the global trade system, as we heard this morning, is in one of the worst crises in a generation. And a quick roundup of the problems lays the nature of the challenge for the region pretty bare. We've seen a global turn towards protectionism, surging rates. This is tracked very well by the Global Trade Alert database run out of St. Gallen. Go and have a look at their data. Every year since the GFC, protectionist measures have been higher and higher and higher, and they certainly accelerated dramatically in 2020 and 2021 as a result of COVID. We've had issues about the effective failure of WTO as its negotiating function. So no round since Uruguay, which is 25 years ago now. And even when we look at some sectoral agreements, progress isn't being made. The fishery subsidies agreement didn't get up just recently, and ongoing log jams in environmental goods and the dispute settlement reform process as well. There's also the challenge just for the WTO's enforcement function related to the long-standing disagreement over the appellate body, which for the last 2 years has led to the US vetoing new appointments to the AB. It's now in court, which has posed this appeal into the void, as it's called, problem, that if you lose a WTO dispute through panel, you can just lodge an appeal and that's the end of the matter. You know, whether countries choose to do this is obviously a political decision, but the reality is, in situations where trust and good faith aren't present, the WTO no longer has a functional enforcement mechanism while the AB is in court. I'd also add to the list the rise of coercive trade practices, and this is where governments are using trade barriers not for garden variety protectionism, but as a form of geopolitical punishment during diplomatic disputes. I'm sure everyone's read this because there's been a lot of focus on China, which has deployed this tactic by some counts against 9 countries, certainly in our region, Korea in 2017, Australia in 2020, and we see the Lithuania-EU dispute that's playing out right now. But I think it's important to remember that coercive trade practices are not simply a China thing. You know, we also saw this extensively from the US under the Trump administration, where coercive or threatened trade coercive practices were widely used to bully other countries into making political or trade decisions. These kind of practices are in pretty flagrant breach of WTO rules, but are not easily addressed by any of the existing remedy systems, and they greatly dent global confidence that rules will be upheld. Now, this broader crisis in the global trading system is a serious problem for the Indo-Pacific. The region is highly trade integrated, which economically and developmentally has been an extraordinarily good thing. But it's also therefore, by corollary, highly trade exposed, which in a systemic trade system crisis is a very bad indeed. And the question we'd have to ask then is, can these 2 shiny new mega regional trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific protect us from some of these global headwinds? And I suggest the answer is probably not, unfortunately. RCEP itself is little help for beyond the region trade problems. So its core strength is its inclusivity, that it finds a common landing point the entire region can get behind and sign up to. But this means it's not configured for projecting its provisions out globally. There's no extra regional members, nor clear pathway for them to join, and a comparatively low ambition on standards. CPTPP's problem is the reverse of RCEP, that it has a tight and exclusive, but also controversial membership. Its regional coverage remains patchy. Most of Southeast Asia is still outside CPTPP, as are for the time being China and Korea, notwithstanding their discussions towards accession. There are some serious political controversies over expansion, with dual membership applications coming from China and Taiwan, and questions from several countries in the region, including my own, Australia, as to whether China's merit-worthy of joining the CPTPP, given some of its coercive practices. And then there's also the vexing question of whether the United States would ever rejoin at some point, and do members need to keep the door open for the US in some way or other. So what this means is that CPTPP and RCEP are very good at solving intra-regional trade issues amongst ourselves. But for those extra-regional problems that we face, we need something more. And what I'd argue, in particular in the paper we'll be developing for this out of today, is that the next step for the region's trade agenda probably therefore lies not within, but without the region. Internally, the Indo-Pacific is in a good place. It's certainly doing better than any other region on trade terms around the world at the moment. And while there's still certainly a lot of progress to be made, which PT talked about with RCEP, and we've also mentioned issues about CPTPP expansion agenda, further countries in the region and their trade and economic interests within region trade agreements are going to offer fairly incremental gains. By contrast, the most significant thing we could do now is to try and articulate the values, but certainly principles, rules and provisions that we've developed outwards into the global system to try and buttress rules-based trade at a global level against some of these political headwinds. There's a lot of ways we could do this, of course, but I've got three concrete ideas that I'll present here. The first would be that the region needs to articulate trade issues onto global forums. Many of these problems haven't been solved in trade-specific bodies like the WTO and Geneva, so it's time to take them to a higher political and diplomatic level. Some of the threats to the global trade system and what that will mean need to be put squarely on broader bodies. I'd probably identify the G7 in its plus formats, certainly the G20, East Asia Summit, APEC and the OECD. These above trade bodies need to say there is a problem in trade that we need to do something about. I also believe that governments from the region need to step up their advocacy on and involvement in the vexing question of WTO reform, particularly around disputes. And it's certainly tempting to view the dispute over the appellate body as an EU-US issue, which is largely how the competing proposals have been litigated so far. But the reality is, if this issue leaves the world trade system without a functioning umpire, it affects us all. It can't just be left to Brussels and Washington. And so regional governments could go beyond the general calls we've made for a timely and satisfactory resolution to the debate to directly petitioning these protagonists that this needs to be brought to an end. The AB needs to be restored and we need a functional dispute system that we can all have confidence in. And the third thing the region could do is get much more active in the emerging plurilateral negotiating space in Geneva. These plurilateral modalities where a subset of reform-ready WTO members negotiate in a specific sector are probably the future of global trade negotiations. And they're certainly where the 21st century rules of the road for digital and environment and services are going to be written. So Indo-Pacific governments therefore need to lean in hard to plurilateralism. Environmental goods, e-commerce and services negotiation, as well as this question about carbon pricing and CBAMs are all key domains where the region needs to have a strong voice globally. To put that all together, what I'm trying to argue today is that the regional trade architecture is in surprisingly good health, but external crises emanating at the global level are casting a long shadow over the Indo-Pacific's economic future. And that means that having gotten our own regional house in pretty good order, it's time that we turn our attention to these global level challenges instead. Thank you all.